This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, promoting humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in Israel. As always, you can support us by going to tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review and clicking on the Patreon button to support us, or go to patreon.com/Tel Aviv Review. A little goes a long way. I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Unfortunately, Gilad Halpern isn't with us this week, but he'll be back. Every week we talk about books and research and things that we find fascinating. Today's guest is Dr. Jeremy Pressman. He's an associate professor of political science and director of Middle East studies at the University of Connecticut. Jeremy is also the co-director with Professor Erica Chenoweth, another illustrious Tel Aviv Review guest, of the Crowd Counting Consortium at crowdcounting.org. Jeremy spent the spring of 2019 as a Fulbright Fellow at the Norwegian Nobel Institute in Oslo. We'll be discussing his most recent book, The Sword is Not Enough, Arabs, Israelis, and the Limits of Military Force. It's just been published by Manchester University Press this year, 2020. It's his third book, and the book creates a nice dialogue with several other Tel Aviv Review guests, not only Erica Chenoweth. Jeremy Pressman, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Dahlia.
My pleasure. Tell us, what is the only force works paradigm when it comes to understanding conflict and peace in the Middle East? And what's wrong with that paradigm? I mean, we're going to go into depth about all of this, but can you give us a sort of opening summary?
Sure. If we think about countries having two basic foreign policy tools, one is built around military force, armies, strength, and coercion. And the other tool is built around diplomacy and cooperation and persuasion. The idea here is that some countries overemphasize the use of military force and strength, and that they view negotiations and cooperation as potentially dangerous and signaling a form of weakness. And the challenge is that when you do that, it leads to certain pathologies or shortcomings. It makes it very difficult to reach final peace treaties with some of your adversaries. It can often backfire and lead to much greater insecurity rather than enhancing your national security. And it can also lead leaders in countries to really miss the kinds of diplomatic opportunities and diplomatic off-ramps that might lead to at least less belligerent relations, if not more peaceful relations.
When you say some countries, I put quotations around that. Who would those some countries be in this case?
Well, I think it is something that we could talk about globally, but in this book, I focus in particular on the parties to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And all of them at different times demonstrate this problem of overemphasizing and believing too much in the value of military force. So I mean Egypt, I mean Israel, I mean the Palestinian National Movement, I mean Syria. So I mean really the basic countries and organizations that are part of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Okay. Now, why has the force paradigm been so, paradigmatic? I mean, we are having this conversation in a sort of, I consider it a kind of podcast dialogue with Nathan Thrall, another guest whom we interviewed about his book, The Only Language They Understand. Why does this force paradigm seem so convincing, which was the heart, the heart of Nathan's argument? Why is it so strong?
Yeah, I think there's a few different reasons for that. First of all, look, my argument is not that it's never correct to use force or there's no reason that countries should be armed. There are moments when having military force and even sometimes using military force is necessary for survival. So the first reason that it's such a powerful paradigm is that you can point to historical episodes where it seems like military force was beneficial for advancing national objectives like survival or independence or other kinds of things. The second point I think I'd make is that, look, we live in what many scholars might talk about as a realist world, but just to put it simply, we live in a world that's confrontational, that's competitive in many ways, that there is danger in the world. And so on that basis, it's often easy to kind of make the argument that given the challenges that the world throws at us as leaders of countries or organizations, the natural response might be to lean towards military force. And just one, there's other reasons too, but there's just one more thing I want to mention now, which is the issue of fear, right? Which is, I tend to be someone who's a kind of more strategic analyst about rational factors. But I think we also have to think about emotional factors, that there is something about the ability to drum up fear, both legitimate and sort of more drummed up by political leaders and politicians. And that when you make people feel fearful, it's then easier to transition towards more confrontational and militant policies. And that's not my research. That's if we look into research that political psychologists and others have done about the role that certain emotions can play in making policies more favorable.
Yeah. So, I mean, isn't that basically the theory behind both, all kinds of military force from terrorism straight through to nuclear deterrence? I mean, terrorism essentially inspires fear in people and in the hope of changing political policy. And nuclear armament is rarely actually deployed, but it seems to be primarily a matter of, political strength and psychological maneuvering. Would you agree with that fear is a main aspect of the use of force?
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize fear can cut two different ways, right? If we think about terrorism, the terrorist or terrorist organization really is trying to use fear to get the other side to capitulate, to offer concessions, right? And so that is one way we can think about fear, right? If I'm a nuclear armed country, I'm trying to make my adversaries so fearful of what I can do with those weapons that they'll act in a more conciliatory fashion towards me. But there's another risk too. I said it cuts both ways. There's a risk of escalation, right? There's a risk that if I make you fearful, you don't think about being conciliatory. That the fear makes you think more in terms of a fortress mentality. And so that's, I think, a real challenge here. Is it's not just that fear can cause backing down and moving away from you and letting you have your way. It's also that fear can lead to escalation and greater confrontation.
It could even, in some cases, lead to preemptive action. Isn't that right? Doesn't that characterize some of the situation here in the region?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, classically, the 1967 war, when Israel made the decision that the moves, largely led by Egypt, had gone too far, and that Israel had to move against Egyptian military forces. So, absolutely, it could lead countries to take steps that they might not otherwise take if they weren't as fearful.
Okay, well, I just prompted you to jump into the critical aspect of the use of force, but I still want to walk through some of the main arguments that people make when they justify the force paradigm. And you do lay them out in the book. And I think one of the classic ones is the 1973 argument, the idea that the October War, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, led eventually to the opening that brought Egypt to the table and set the stage for the Camp David peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. Can you lay out that argument, and then we can maybe look at it critically?
Sure. Egypt, if we go back a little bit more to Egypt in 1966 or early 1967, we see a powerful Egypt led by President Nasser, a country that was not only a major player in the Middle East, but was a major influence on the non-aligned movement around the world. And then we see a couple of things happen over the next few years. First, after Egypt escalates in May 1967, Egypt is dealt a stunning military defeat, as are other countries. And it's a real climb down for Nasserism. Famously, Nasser offers his resignation, which the Egyptian public rejects. But so the first thing is that leading into 1973, Egypt's turn towards military force in 1967 struck a massive blow to Egypt's political capital. Secondly, leading into 1967, we see the war of attrition, and we see, as Nasser dies and Sadat takes power, we see Sadat's early effort to put feelers out to Israel and the United States that aren't really successful.
Right, you mean leading up to 73, yeah.
Yeah, leading up to 73. So I think there's a backstory there that's important, but the common argument is in 1973, leading into the war, Israel and the United States they expected Egypt to come to the table sort of groveling and making most of the concessions, and that the 1973 war shakes that. It shakes the U.S.-Israeli position, but it also reinforces to Egypt that it's not going to regain Sinai Peninsula by by military force, and therefore Egypt wanting both to restore this piece of sovereign territory, the Sinai Peninsula, and also wanting to turn towards the United States for economic and political reasons, and maybe strategic reasons too, starts to pivot. And therefore, starting with the Kissinger era, we really start to see a dramatic change in Egyptian-Israeli relations. From 1973 until the peace treaty in 1979, a number of agreements that rapidly and dramatically transformed the bilateral relationship between Egypt and Israel, and fundamentally transformed the strategic relationship of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I think that's the standard story. If I start to think about critiquing it, I mean, first of all, Sadat was putting out feelers before the 1973 war. So the fact that it took a war is itself a sign of the limitations of military force. And it may be that part of the reason that Israel and to a lesser extent the United States were unable to recognize those feelers is what I talk about in the book in chapter 5 in terms of missed diplomatic opportunities, right? The great success of 1967 had Israel at a high point militarily and strategically, and the thought that they needed to step toward Egypt at all seemed like quite a foreign thought. So I think that the cost of the 1967 and 73 war were quite high, and that's worth bearing in mind. Finally, I just add that in 1973, if the standard telling is 1973 or the combination of 67 and 73, Egypt learned the lesson that it was never going to retake Sinai, let alone defeat Israel through war, and therefore turned to peace, and that it was Israeli military might that did that. Egypt had already learned that lesson prior to the 1973 war. And in a sense, you could say the war would have been unnecessary if diplomacy had been taken seriously in 1971, 1972.
Well, here's what I find interesting. And people who make the causal link between war and agreements. Okay, so in this example, it's classic. They'll start with 1973 and say that prompted the Camp David Accords. But why do we limit the causal chain to that? Couldn't we also just as well say the 1967 war led us to a second war, first of all, 1973, and that after the peace agreement, that it was in fact the agreement that changed the dynamics in the Middle East for the better, certainly between Israel and Egypt, because of the agreement, not because of war? I mean, my question is, how valid is the force paradigm if you're looking at causal links and a dependent variable, where peace is the dependent variable?
Well, I think there's a larger point. I don't think we want to get deep into methodology, but I mean, I think the larger point is that where we pick to begin the story, whether we're talking about Egyptian-Israeli relations or the Arab-Israeli conflict or whatever political phenomena, where we choose to begin the historical narrative is going to do some of the legwork for the particular point that we're trying to make. And so if we're focused on causality, just as you point out, the decision to start the story in 1973 rather than in 1970 at the end of the War of Attrition, or in 1967, or even going further back, that decision, that initial decision of where does the historical narrative start for our purposes for this question is going to be crucial. And so, yes, in this particular case, I'm pushing to expand the question. And to be honest, one of the things I expect with my book is that in certain historical cases, people will probably say, why did you start that case at date X? If you look further back, you see that this party did something that led, right? There's always a causal chain that goes deeper. So I think there's a methodological aspect to this. Why do people choose to start on 1973? I mean, I don't know their particular decisions or psychology, but I can say that it's convenient to start in 1973 if the point you want to make is that the 1973 war was crucial in teaching Egypt a lesson that led to peace.
Okay, but of course that's not the only example. Another major argument, to my mind, the three major examples of the force paradigm are 73. The first Intifada, which you cover, which many people believe led Israel towards the Oslo Accords of 1993. And then maybe later we can talk about the second Intifada leading to Israel's withdrawal of settlements from Gaza. But do you think that the criticism you would make of those runs along the same lines, that they don't start with the full picture, or they start at, one arbitrary event, not arbitrary, but fail to see prior events? Or do you think each of those cases can be, is critiqued separately based on particular contextual circumstances?
I think we have to go back to how I'm trying to position my book as different from the conventional argument, right? The conventional argument is that the other side only understands force. My argument is not that the other side only understands diplomacy and cooperation. My argument is somewhere in the middle, right? It is true that there are cases where military force plays a role in changing how other adversaries behave. And that's something I talk about in chapter 2 of the book. But it's also true, and this is the piece that the conventional wisdom wants to forget, that some of those very same moments, right, are also doing work undermining the success of military force and even demonstrating how cooperation, diplomacy, concessions, negotiation can work. So let's look at some of the examples that we've talked about, like taking the Second Intifada. Certainly, in 2005, when Israel was pulling civilian settlers out of Gaza, Hamas portrayed that as a dramatic victory for military force. We stood strong against the Israelis. We've fought them. We continued armed struggle when the PLO pursued negotiations. The Oslo process that the PLO pursued collapsed in failure. They got nothing out of negotiations. And we pursued military force, and we got Israel to pull out its settlements. And that's a fine argument in September 2005, right? But here we are in 2020. Gaza is in a disastrous economic and humanitarian situation. The Palestinian national movement is no closer, if not further, from fulfilling the dream of Palestinian self-determination. And so what I would say is, rather than trying to take some of these contested historical events and saying, well, that proves that military force worked, right? 1973, the Second Intifada, whatever the historical example is, I think we have to take more of a complex approach and understand that it depends, and partly gets back to your earlier point, depending how we start the historical narrative and what time period, these major historical events are open to ways in which they both help and hurt the dominant narrative about military force and help and hurt the secondary narrative about the power of cooperation and negotiation. And I won't go on about this, but I think another compelling example is 1982 and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon.
Oh, please go on about that.
I think it's a compelling illustration of the duality and the nuance that's necessary to understand historical events. On the one hand, right, Israel goes into Lebanon in 1982, invades Lebanon, and the PLO is routed. Israel's primary adversary in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the time is not only routed, but agrees to leave Lebanon. And for the first time since 1967, not only did they leave Lebanon, but they're in distant Tunisia. They're no longer in a frontline state right on the border of Israel. And so on the one hand, you could say, what a great success, right? That was one of Israel's goals, was to end the PLO mini-state in Lebanon, and what a great success.
And of course, naturally, Israel almost managed to mastermind having a new ally in Lebanon.
Yes, absolutely. And that was, a second goal was a treaty with the Lebanese government. But on the other hand, I think we have to look at the other pieces of it, right? The treaty ultimately fails, right? The Lebanese government abrogates and backs away from the idea of a rapprochement with Israel. And more importantly, 1982 is really crucial in the development of Hezbollah. And so in some ways, what Israel does is replaces the PLO with a different organization and a different adversary in Lebanon, one that today is armed with tens of thousands of missiles and rockets aimed at Israel and serves as an important conduit or connection between Iran and the frontline states of Israel. Maybe the important connection, or as important as Syria. So on the one hand, there was some success, you could say, about military force. Israel defeated its primary adversary, at least dealt its primary adversary a major setback in the PLO. At the same time, though, Israel plants the seeds for disastrous runs, including, by the way, we get to 2000, when as a result of what happens in 1982, Israel unilaterally disengages from southern Lebanon, which itself causes other security problems for Israel.
And I just want to point out the irony of the fact that, during all the years when I was coming to learn about Israel and eventually making the decision to move here, the main thing that hung over, cast a huge pall over Israeli life was the 18 years of the occupation of southern Lebanon. It's almost like we don't talk about that anymore, but people were dying in a kind of, a little war of attrition that had no name. It was just an occupation. And then, of course, the major helicopter crash that killed over 70 soldiers. It was a national trauma, I would say. And now sometimes I think historians look back and just remember that some things were achieved in 1982. And then maybe the seeds that were planted for later are not so good. But I think that it is incumbent on us to remember also all the damage of that occupation itself, and not to mention to the Lebanese.
Yeah, if I could just jump in here, this book is largely a book about states, about policies, about strategy. But I do, at a couple moments in the book, mention individuals who were killed in the conflict, and I do that intentionally to try and remind not just the reader, but also myself, that just as what you're saying, that while all this is happening, yes, of course, we have to talk about the strategy, but we can't do that disconnected from the human cost and the human suffering that's associated with the decisions that are being made.
I mean, I couldn't agree more in that you certainly preempted another question of mine, which I was thinking of saving for last, but let's just discuss it here, which is what is the place of these human and moral considerations in the social sciences?
Well, I would credit in particular the feminist or gendered stream of IR, of international relations, the discipline in which I sit, for pushing this very issue, pushing it inside academia. But I think it has a much larger question. This isn't something new. This has been going on for several decades now. The feminist scholars have been arguing that there's a certain dismissal or bypassing of the human dimension of what's going on in international politics. I'm not putting it as eloquently as some of those scholars have done. I mean, I think of one of the very accessible examples that Carol Cohen wrote about her experience interacting with defense intellectuals who were talking about nuclear war, but in a totally anodyne way, had totally sort of stripped away the reality of what they were talking about. You're not just talking about missiles and the probability of hits, and that you're talking about the destruction potentially of millions or hundreds of millions of people. And so I think that within international relations, there's been a pushback against a solely strategic and policy-oriented approach, because those things have implications for people. I want to take something of a middle position and say that at all moments we need to remember the human dimension and be thinking about that. But those humans have suffered and died as a result of policy and strategic decisions that are made. So I want the I guess you could say the worst of both worlds. Right? I want us to understand the larger decisions that are being made and the larger currents in international relations. But I also want us to remember who pays the price for those decisions and what can happen if we make good or bad decisions, or if politicians make good or bad decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a very valuable contribution myself. Let's go to sort of what I would call the main theme of your, or the secondary main theme of your book. I shouldn't say secondary because they're really parallel themes, which is that we underappreciate, this is my paraphrasing, that we underappreciate the value of diplomacy and agreements. And maybe we'll talk about expanded versions of nonviolent action. But can you tell us how you view that other paradigm by contrast to the force paradigm? And then maybe we can also talk about having the right dose of each in a realistic context.
Yeah, sure. So I do, as you suggested, think there's a secondary idea.
But not secondary in terms of inferior.
Right, not secondary in terms of inferior, but in terms of who's had the lion's share of the spotlight. Right. This is the idea. If the dominance of military force is center stage, this is the idea that's standing off to the side, waiting for its opportunity to shine.
The supporting actor.
Yes.
Or actress.
Supporting actor, or the understudy, maybe. which has occasional moments, and we can talk about that when it has been, has asserted itself and has been influencing policy. But the idea is really just the inverse of the first idea I suggested, right? That the way to get what you want in international affairs, right? And we're talking about how do you achieve your fundamental goals of national survival, of national security, of a certain quality of life that's not disrupted by war and confrontation. How do you economic success? How do you achieve all that? The diplomacy is going to play a particular role, but not just diplomacy, right? Because diplomacy can be used. Diplomacy is an instrument that can be used for all kinds of things. In particular, I want to emphasize diplomacy that's moving toward A, negotiations, and B, the possibility of making concessions, right? What's crucial in this second way of thinking is sometimes at the negotiating table, I have to be willing to give up things that are important to me in exchange for the other side doing the same. I can't just always fall back on, well, if I can't get what I want, I'm just going to fight it out, right? So instead, this second idea is that negotiations and concessions, mutual concessions, play an important part in achieving these fundamental goals. And the opposite of the first idea also, that military force often backfires. Right, that military force often pushes us further away from normalcy and peaceful relations. Military force often leads to greater insecurity.
Right, and you do provide a long list of those greater insecurities, which is helpful, and I think that it's very easy to pin those to various conflagrations in this region. But let me ask you about the peace process side of it. So, would you go so far as to claim that diplomacy is dependably effective at preventing wars? Or let's say if an agreement is reached. What does the record show in your book?
I would say that the pursuit of cooperative international relations is simply a possibility. It's a plausible pathway. It's not guaranteed. And we have definitive evidence that it can fail spectacularly, right? In terrible ways. On the one hand, the point I think that comes out in the book in part is that proponents of the belief that military force is always or almost always the answer cherry pick their examples and cherry pick their historical starting point. And if you wanted to do the same for diplomacy, I suppose you could do that, right? You'd focus on two successes or maybe more, but you'd focus certainly on the 1970s that we talked about earlier and the road to the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. You could also focus, I guess, on the Israel-Jordan treaty of 1994. Maybe there's a few other moments that are surprising, like the armistice talks going back to 1949.
We may be witnessing one of those moments now, I assume, with Israel having signed, having reached an agreement with the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah, I think that's a complex example, and we can. I'm certainly happy to talk about that. But just to finish the cherry picking point, I mean, you could cherry pick those moments, but I mean, I think you also have to reckon with the wreckage of the Oslo process in particular, or also, as I talk about in the book, you have to reckon with the fact that Israel and Syria were very close to a deal where Israel would have left the Golan Heights. And in fact, it didn't happen. So I think, I have to be conscious of the fact that, no, there are historical examples that undermine this argument as well. But I would say if you want to turn to the most recent events, to the announcement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, I think that it offers a lot of interesting dimensions to it, right? So first of all, I want to be careful because many things that the Trump administration has been involved in, I'm not talking about just in the Middle East, but in general, many claimed economic or diplomatic agreements don't pan out when we see the actual details, when we see how they actually unfold. So I think there's a big asterisk here, which is we first have to see how this unfolds. But let's say, for the sake of discussion, it unfolds in the way that Prime Minister Netanyahu or President Trump expected to. So on the one hand, you could say, well, this is a triumph for diplomacy, right? This is a cooperative agreement and the move towards normalization. At the same time, I think you could say this is a minor step, and I don't want to overstate it, but this is a minor step in the direction of accepting that Israeli settlement, coercion, and repression of the Palestinians can just be sort of left to the side as other things start to normalize. And as I talk about near the end of the book, I guess I'm not supposed to give away the end of the book,
but we'll forgive you for spoilers.
Yeah, since it's nonfiction, I feel more comfortable doing that. As I talk about the end, if ultimately the whole world accepts Israel and its current borders, and by that I mean including the occupation, if the whole world accepts Israel as legitimate, then I think that undermines the argument I'm trying to make here.
Right. Because I mean, it kind of depends on what you count as force.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm trying to explain to myself because it makes it really depends to some extent what we can count as force, right? We often think of force as an open warfare, escalations, but it's worth remembering. I think that is what it seems like. This is what you're getting at, that Israel's policy in the West Bank through a military occupation governing the region for 53 years is a form of force that might be shown to have paid off.
Yes. So let me say two things. Absolutely, by force, I mean we need to be thinking about more than just war. And you can do, people can do a little thought experiment, right? Imagine Israel's occupation of the West Bank, but you're not allowed to have the IDF participate in the occupation or defending settlements. That's number one. And number two, you're not allowed to take land from people who don't want to give up that land or believe it's their land, right? In terms of like specific land owners or farms or villages, right? Then the occupation and the settlement project wouldn't have worked, right? It depends on the presence of the Israeli military. It depends on Israel's ability to, in many cases, coerce land from Palestinians. And so, yes, I think it's important to have an expansive view of military force. But, getting back to the larger argument, if Israel can go forward with these current policies, and at the end of the day, not only does the international community accept Israel as a legitimate state, but also the Palestinian national movement decides, you know what? Well, in the past, we were for Palestinian self-determination. We're going to give up now because Israel is too powerful and they've kind of won and it's over. Then the thesis of this book would be wrong, right? So I don't expect that. But if that happens, then I'll be the first to say that the hesitation I have about military force maybe was overstated.
Although it's hard for me not to play devil's advocate even there because there was no force used between Israel and the UAE. It throws into question, what direction of force are we talking about? Yes, Israel's used force with the Palestinians. It has not reached a resolution with the Palestinians. Force has not helped those sides reach a resolution. The fact that Israel and the UAE may be making steps in that direction, almost famously at this point has been overanalyzed as being possibly unrelated. So the question is, if we're trying to think of a causal link between the use of force and concessions, you could even argue there's not much of a link, even if the UAE agreement holds.
I agree with everything you said, and that's partly why earlier I called the UAE-Israel announcement a minor step in the direction of what I said earlier, right? So I agree with you, but what I do think that there's a tenuous connection between the UAE-Israel announcement and the current Israeli government's effort to bury the Palestinian question, right? So each small step of legitimacy that Israel gains, I would argue, in the international community is one of the two key barometers for whether Israel can simply plow forward and keep a lid on the Palestinian movement, keep a repressive lid on the Palestinian movement. So I agree with you. It's not about how force affected Emirati-Israeli relations to me. It's about how that announcement can be seen as a very slight support towards the idea that Israel can continue to coerce Palestinians and not pay any price for it in the international community. I think we're a very long way from that, right? First of all, because as you said, Israel and the United Arab Emirates were never at war. And secondly, because it also requires the major players in international politics to make a difference. And it requires the Palestinian national movement to make a different decision.
True, but I'm just going to point out that it could completely reinforce your thesis if history takes us in a different direction, which is that maybe Netanyahu is right, and this kind of agreement, if it comes to pass, will in the long term be supportive of some sort of arrangement with the Palestinians and Israelis that both sides can live with. I will, of course, qualify that and say I have my doubts. But if that happens, it would only reinforce your point that diplomacy and an agreement maybe can be supportive of further diplomacy and agreements.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if what you're suggesting is that if this agreement, or again, this announcement.
Yes, it's an announcement.
This announcement, an announcement to continue talking towards an agreement. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I guess in that sense, right, if it moves towards autonomy and the Palestinian National Movement accepts that, I guess you could say that this agreement was one step towards that. I guess I'm just skeptical that something short of either a two-state solution or equal rights for all, I guess I'm just skeptical that the Palestinian National Movement will ever accept that as a resolution. And it's hard to imagine a right-wing Israeli government, at least in 2020, negotiating either of those outcomes.
Sure. I mean, and all this is quite speculative about the future. I want to leave another minute. We're getting close to the end, but I want you to tell us about your work with another guest, which I mentioned in the beginning, Erica Chenoweth. She wrote a book on nonviolent political action. We had a great discussion about that. What are you doing together? What is the Crowd Counting Consortium we talked about in the beginning?
Sure, and thanks for asking. When the first Women's March happened in the United States in 2017, Erica and I started counting. We were surprised by how much, or I should say, I was surprised by how many different locations, over 650 locations on that day in January 2017. We counted not only the locations, but also the number of people who turned out. After that Women's March, we decided, hey, there's something to this. Let's keep trying to provide a public, real-time website, or as close to real-time as we can do, that provides information about protests going on all around the United States. So although it started with the Women's March, we provide information on protests on anything going on in the United States. Protests, marches, demonstrations, strikes when we can. We rely primarily on media reports, although we also get submissions from the public and from social media. And we're just trying to document the protesting that's going on in the United States. It becomes, particularly important at certain moments. And this summer certainly unfolded for me differently than I expected, given the intensity of protests in the United States. That was what we were spending a lot of our time on. So we try and collect the data. We make it available for the public, for other scholars, and then we also try and write about it. And we've done that, particularly the Monkey Cage in the Washington Post has been very generous with publishing a lot of the information that we've shared about protests. And that's a continuing project. As we speak, we and research assistants and volunteers are working on tallying information.
Well, there's no question that we could say very similar words about this summer in Israel, where there have been ongoing protests, many of them mass scale, against Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I think what a lot of people are asking, both the protesters and those who are opposed to them or who support Netanyahu, are, does it matter?
I think, and this isn't my direct research, but I think there's no question that protests matter. And by matter, I mean that they affect political outcomes and that they affect important political outcomes. I think the scholarship on this is very clear. I would speculate, and I can say a word about that, but I would speculate that the idea that protests don't matter, that it's just a bunch of angry people going out on the street, is an idea that the targets of protests are very happy to hear and to stimulate through the media, through political speech, whatever it is. But the reality is that scholars who studied protests have demonstrated that the presence of protests in an area can lead to greater voter turnout, that the presence of protests in an area can affect which candidates run for office, that the presence of protests in an area can affect the policy choices, at least in the US, that state legislatures make that if we look at protests, and this is something we're hoping to do with a group of people about the recent anti-racism protests, that from the micro level of what your mayor says about your police department's policy on chokeholds to the macro level of what your state or federal legislature is doing, that it can make a difference. And, we'll see in 2020, what happens in the election and whether places with protests affect the outcome. The other thing I'd say that I think is really important, scholars have demonstrated, is the spillover effects or energy that protests create. It's not just about being at the protests, right? Protest organizations, by and large, understand that they have to connect to the political process. And at least I can speak from the US context. Protesters this summer were very attentive to the fact that protesting in the street was only one of the tools at their disposal, and registering people to vote, writing to elected officials, convincing people to go out and vote when that was possible or whatever, and will be possible again in November, that those were all important steps too. So I would say there's a certain energy and engagement and connection and networking that happens from protest as well. And that's been really important for outcomes downstream.
Okay, well, we'll see where all this goes, but I think it's a very good complement to your work. We've been discussing your recent book, The Sword is Not Enough, Arabs, Israelis, and the Limits of Military Force. Jeremy Pressman, thank you for having been on the show.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
And thanks to Itai Shelem, our sound engineer and producer, and again to the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute for their generous support. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like you to consider please writing a review. We like critical ones, supportive ones. Say anything you like. It's in the ratings and review section. Just go in there and write one. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have about 600 interviews. And if you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Follow me and Gilad on Twitter and join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.